Our program is exclusively peaceful, has always been and will always remain exclusively peaceful. None of those measures include closing any of our facilities. The proud people of Iran would never accept that. Our facilities will continue. We will continue enriching. We will continue research and development. Our heavy water reactor will be modernized, and we will continue the Fordo facility.
That, of course, the foreign minister from Iran selling his version of the agreement that we heard about yesterday between the P5+1 and the country of Iran. We have a lot of people here in this hour to talk to about this. This, of course, is hour 3 of the Steve Malzberg Show. If you're looking for Steve, you can see he's not here. I am Rick Unger, filling in with my partner, Betsy. Good to have you.
Thank you. As
always. We are going to do a lot in this hour talking about Iran and some other things. We're going to begin with somebody who I think is one of the better experts to hear from on this subject. He joined us 2 days ago, and I found so interesting we invited him back for today. That, of course, is Dr. Herbert London, who is president of the London Center for Policy Research, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and the author of the Transformational Decade. He also has a piece running in Newsmax magazine, which I'd highly recommend to you. It's entitled "The Middle East, the Worst is Yet to Come." Dr. London, that is a very depressing headline.
Well, it's a depressing headline, and I think an accurate one. I think what we've seen with this agreement is that this is the beginning of what I regard as a very significant slide. I can't imagine that the Congress is going to accept this, but the President has described it as historic, and he's accurate. It is historic, but historic in the most negative way. It will create an environment that will lead to proliferation. It will create an environment that will make the Sunni nations quite uncomfortable, and they will certainly go out and try and get nuclear weapons of their own. The continued opportunity to engage in enrichment only means that at some point Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon, and they're given a green light. In 10 years, they do have a green light, according to the agreement.
Is there anything you think the world could do that would really stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon?
Yes, I think there are a number of things the world can do. Number one, the United States, I think, played its hand very, very unfortunately. The United States could have said from the outset, we are not going to accept the continued enrichment of uranium. They could have said, number two, if you do so, there will be a sanctions regimen that we will maintain. Number three, they could have said, if the sanctions regimen does not work, there'll be a naval blockade. For after all, there's no refined petroleum in Iran. So there's a lot that the United States could have done without necessarily going to war, as the President suggested. He created this bifurcation. That is, either you accept this agreement or you go to war. It's nonsensical. It's silly.
Well, it's interesting. You've actually, Betsy, I know Betsy is, a little programming notice, these two guys see things a little bit differently than me, and they're coming to get me, and they're both good at it. So
well, the facts, fortunately,
let me
are on
just
our
throw this
side.
one in, and then I'll give it to you, Betsy. You at least just did something that I'm not hearing anybody do, which is give alternatives. Now, on your first point, I was thinking, okay, but they could just say no. But you did raise some other things we can do, which is to continue sanctions, although I always like to point out, hasn't worked that well up until now. So I'd love to know why you think it would work if we can get everybody else to continue with us. And talk more about your blockade idea.
Well,
that's something I haven't heard.
Sanctions have worked.
Well, the sanctions have worked in at least bringing Iran to the table. And I think the other dimension of this that I think is very important to understand, there have been many exceptions in the so-called sanctions regimen. That is, China has been permitted to engage in trade. Turkey has been permitted to engage in trade. Right. But if you really had a real sanctions regimen, it would put an enormous amount of pressure on Iran. But when I said a naval blockade, since petroleum is not available, refined petroleum is not available in Iran, that's all imported, a naval blockade would pretty much paralyze the country. So there are a lot of things that you can do without necessarily going to war, or an all-out war. What a blockade will lead to is very difficult to say. But there are certain steps that can be taken, and I think by and large have been overlooked during the course of these negotiations, in large part because President Obama wants to bring about this understanding. This is his legacy. He wants it. He wants it more than the Iranians want it. The consequence of that is we make all of the concessions. They don't make any concessions.
That's it.
And this deal will mean the destruction of Israel. So what is Israel's response likely to be?
That's a pretty dramatic statement to say this deal will mean the destruction of Israel.
It will mean the destruction of Israel because Iran has promised to destroy Israel.
The Supreme Leader, Khomeini, said, and I'm quoting him, "There is no cure for Israel. There's only annihilation." No, if you're in
Doesn't mean
Netanyahu's
they'll
seat.
succeed.
Well,
I
of course
understand
not.
what their
Of course
desire
not.
is.
No, but if you're sitting in Netanyahu's seat and you're saying the United States is complicit in this treaty, and we no longer can rely on the United States to help defend us with its nuclear umbrella, what do you do?
Yeah. Okay. We're going to continue this. We actually reserved 2 blocks for you. You're very good at this, Dr. London. We love having you on to talk about
Pleasure
it.
to be with you.
So when we come back, you get a little bit more of Dr. Herbert London, which I think you'll find awfully useful. I know I do. I love this blockade. I want to talk more about this. Nobody has ever brought that up to me. We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more with Dr. London when we return on the Steve Malzberg Show. Back with Dr. Herbert London, president of the London Center for Policy Research, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, author of The Transformational Decade, and I got to get this in again because it's such a great piece, in Newsmax magazine. That's a bad mistake to make around here. Newsmax magazine, The Middle East, the worst is yet to come. Betsy, why don't you begin this round?
Oh, good. Well, I'm dying to ask you this. The London Center really has its pulse on Congress, and you do a lot to educate members of Congress and their staff. Is there the conviction, are there the votes to actually stop this deal?
I think one of the issues is whether the Congress really has a role to play. The president is going to argue this is a presidential activity. We have unilateral authority over it. It's not a treaty. Therefore, from a constitutional standpoint, there is no need for confirmation from the Senate. That's the argument that will be made. I don't know whether, in fact, anyone in the Congress can buy it. I think there's even bipartisan support for an examination of what is in this treaty. So I think that there will be great pushback on the part of the Congress.
This always confuses me. Is there any authority to tell us how you separate a treaty from this executive agreement? I mean, to me, this is pretty big. It sounds like a treaty to me, but I don't know how they determine
Rick, I think it's an excellent point, and in fact, it's very difficult to tell. This is a distinction without a difference. By and large, they're the same. This certainly looks and acts and quacks like a treaty, but it won't be called a treaty. It's been called a deal, it's been called an arrangement, it's been called an understanding, it's a framework, but no one will call it a treaty.
But Congress still has the power to intervene if there are enough votes in Congress to keep those sanctions in place and actually increase them, right?
How much of a mess would that cause? I'm curious.
Well, I think that it will lead to a constitutional crisis.
It will.
There's no doubt in my mind that that will happen. But there is also no doubt in my mind that there will be pushback, and as I indicated, bipartisan pushback. A lot of Democrats are going to say, we are very much concerned about this deal. But people like...
You notice I didn't correct you.
Yeah.
But people like Senator Schumer, of course, are in a very awkward position.
Right. Because
on the one hand, he wants the White House's support for what he presumes will be his future as the majority leader in the Senate. On the other hand, he also realizes he's going to lose the Jewish community if he doesn't say something about this.
It's interesting. This morning, and of course Congress is on vacation, as they usually are, but I wanted to try and track down what the response that people in Congress were giving. So far, they are dividing up among the expected lines. Democrats are being supportive, Republicans are being not very supportive. You know, I wonder if the Democrats will, once they get back, take a different point of view. It's going to be fascinating.
I think obviously the party is going to be fragmented. There will be some Democrats who will stay with the president, but a good many will not.
Well,
and those who care about the future of Israel obviously are going to line up with the Republicans on this matter.
And with the 2016 elections approaching, elections are always approaching when you're in Washington, many Democrats are going to have their eye on the Jewish vote.
Yes.
Do we believe this will become a substantial issue in
the 2016 election? Oh, it is a substantial issue, Rick. There's no doubt about it. I mean, Israel is really put in the crosshairs. And if you think about it, the future of Israel is very much dependent on how this shakes out. Because what Netanyahu will do is to think very carefully about whether an attack is necessary or what kind of strategy is necessary for Israel. Will he be able to work with the Sunni nations that are concerned about this? So it becomes very interesting from a strategic vision point of view. And his strategic vision is largely dependent on the landscape in the Middle East.
There was something I wanted to ask you the other day when you were here, and we just didn't have the time. I'm going to try it now. I have a very hard time, not being an expert in foreign policy, looking at the situation in the Middle East and saying, you know, this is Obama's fault. He screwed this up. I can understand somebody who makes that argument. At the same time, I can look at it and go, you know what? Nobody can control the Middle East. Maybe it's the bad fortune he had to be president at this time, because we always have a disaster every generation. What do you think about that?
I think the Middle East is very complicated. You know the story of the scorpion and the frog. I won't go into it here. And that is the Middle East. And so there's no question it's a very complicated area. There are a lot of things that the president could have done. I think he mishandled this foreign policy decision. There is no doubt in my mind that when I had a conversation with President Sisi, he went through a very penetrating analysis of all of the mistakes that Obama has made, starting with Libya. You bomb Libya and then you leave. And you've just created chaos in the country. He made comments about what's happened in Egypt, where in fact promises were made in the war against the factions, the terrorist factions in the Sinai, and he didn't deliver. Sisi was called a military coup leader, when in fact it wasn't a military coup. So there have been a lot of mistakes that have been made, things that could have been handled very differently in the Middle East by this administration. And I think, if anything, one would have to look at this dispassionately and say the president lied repeatedly. And it's a little bit like someone saying—
in the Middle East issue?
Yeah, in the Middle East. I think he really hasn't told the truth about it, just as I don't believe he's being entirely truthful about this agreement.
And of course he refuses to leave the bargaining table.
Right, it reminds me of the conversation between a prostitute and a man, and the man says, you know, I'm a politician and I'm trustworthy, and the prostitute looks at him and says, I'm a prostitute and I'm a virgin.
All right, Doctor, I could talk to you all day long. I really could. Thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure to be with you.
We're going to get you back yet again soon, because you teach us a lot. Coming up next, Chief Forecaster for Weatherbill Analytics, Joe Bastardi, is going to talk a little bit about the water crisis in California. Steve Malzberg Show. Come back and stay with us.